On August 17, 1863, as the Civil War raged across Mississippi, every newspaper in Jackson reported the same auction. A young woman, barely 21, was sold for a price that shattered every record in Confederate Mississippi. They called her the most exquisite female slave ever brought to the Capitol Street auction house. But what those papers didn't print, what the auctioneers never revealed, was the secret that made her sale not just extraordinary, but impossible. 9 witnesses would later swear under oath that the young woman standing on that platform couldn't have existed. Not because of how she looked, but because of who she was. The city's most powerful Confederate families fought to own her. One of them succeeded. Within 2 months, that family would be obliterated. The records of her sale were sealed by the Mississippi legislature in 1864 and have never been opened. Until now, no one has asked the question that should have been obvious from the beginning. Why would anyone pay a fortune for a slave who was already legally dead? Before we continue with the story of the Capitol Street auction house and the young woman who should never have been there, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from Mississippi, Louisiana, or anywhere in the Deep South, leave a comment telling me your state. Because what happened in Jackson in 1863 might have echoed into your own family's history. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories they tried to bury, hit that subscribe button right now. The answer to that question begins not in Jackson, but in a place that has been deliberately erased from every map. Bellamont Plantation sat 31 miles southwest of Vicksburg, a cotton empire that had belonged to the Ashford family since 1798. By 1863, it was one of the few operations in Mississippi still functioning despite the war, producing over 600 bales of cotton annually through the labor of 183 enslaved people who somehow kept working even as Union gunboats patrolled the river and Confederate deserters roamed the countryside looking for food. The main house was a monument to Delta aristocracy. 2 stories of red brick with white columns reaching 3 stories high, imported from Virginia in 1812. Magnolias lined the drive, their white blooms so large and fragrant that visitors said you could smell Bellamont from half a mile away. The scent was either intoxicating or sickening, depending on what you knew about how the money for those trees had been made. The Ashford family were Delta royalty, English-descended Protestants who traced their lineage back to Yorkshire and considered themselves the true inheritors of Southern civilization. They spoke with cultivated accents, attended Episcopal services, and married within an exclusive circle of families whose names appeared in the original territorial land grants. To be an Ashford was to belong to the elite that had built Mississippi. An elite that had its own rules, its own hierarchies, its own understanding of bloodlines and breeding that they discussed at dinner parties with the same clinical detachment they used when discussing their horses. Colonel Marcus Ashford, the plantation's owner in 1863, was 61 years old, a widower for 12 years, and by all accounts, a man of impeccable breeding and ruthless business acumen. He kept detailed records in Morocco-bound ledgers, each entry written in his angular script, each calculation verified against market prices in New Orleans and Memphis. He had served 1 term in the Mississippi legislature before the war, sat on the board of 3 banks, and had married his 2 sons to daughters of governors. His reputation was unimpeachable, a man who honored contracts, paid debts promptly, and ran his plantation with what he called enlightened efficiency. His slaves were well fed by the standards of the time, rarely whipped in public, and trained in skills that made them valuable assets. His younger sister, Vivian, was an entirely different creature. Vivian Ashford Whitmore had always been the difficult one, the passionate one, the one who wrote poetry and painted watercolors, and once threw a crystal decanter at a dinner guest who suggested women shouldn't express political opinions. While Marcus learned cotton cultivation and commodity trading, Vivian learned French, studied botany, and developed opinions about abolition that she was wise enough to keep mostly to herself. When their father died in 1834, he left the plantation entirely to Marcus, giving Vivian only a generous dowry and the expectation that she would marry appropriately and cause no trouble. Vivian, then 19, married a tobacco merchant named Reginald Whitmore within the year. It was considered a good match. Whitmore had money, connections in Virginia, and the good sense to let his wife maintain her own interests. They settled in Natchez, and for 8 years, Marcus heard from his sister only through occasional letters about garden parties and literary societies. Then in 1842, Vivian did something unforgivable. She returned to Mississippi alone. No husband, no explanation, just Vivian and a young woman she introduced as her ward and companion. The letter announcing her return arrived in September. Brief and deliberately vague. Marcus, I have left Reginald. The marriage was unsustainable. I have returned to Mississippi with my companion, Miss Catherine Sterling. We will be residing in Natchez. I do not require your approval, only your acknowledgement that I remain your sister. Vivian. What Vivian didn't mention, what Marcus discovered within days through the efficient gossip network of Mississippi society, was that Catherine Sterling was not what she appeared to be. She was beautiful. That much was immediately obvious to anyone who saw her. Petite, perhaps 5'3", with an extraordinary face that seemed to shift between classical beauty and something more exotic depending on the light. Her skin was pale, the kind of translucent paleness that suggested Northern European ancestry with a hint of rose in her cheeks. Her hair was an unusual shade of auburn, almost copper in sunlight, worn in elaborate styles that suggested both wealth and careful attention. Her eyes were large and an arresting shade of gray-green, framed by dark lashes that needed no enhancement. But more than her appearance, it was her bearing that drew attention. She moved with a grace that suggested dance training. She spoke in a soft, cultured voice with an accent that was difficult to place. Not quite Southern, not quite Northern, something refined and deliberately ambiguous. She wore expensive but understated dresses, played piano with genuine skill, and demonstrated knowledge of literature and current events that surprised anyone who assumed a young woman traveling as a companion would be uneducated. Natchez society was immediately fascinated and immediately suspicious. Within 2 weeks, Marcus received 3 separate letters from concerned friends. Catherine Sterling, they informed him, was almost certainly not who Vivian claimed. Her appearance suggested mixed ancestry, the texture of her hair beneath the elaborate styling, certain features that became more apparent in unguarded moments, a quality to her skin that experienced eyes recognized as indicating African heritage, however distant. If Catherine Sterling was indeed a person of color, even partially, then Vivian was violating every social convention by treating her as a companion rather than a servant. And if Vivian had brought her from Virginia, there were disturbing questions about how she had obtained her and what exactly their relationship was. Marcus's response was immediate and harsh. He traveled to Natchez and confronted his sister in the parlor of the modest house she had rented. "Who is she really?" he demanded. Vivian met his eyes without flinching. "She is exactly who I said. My companion." "Is she colored?" "I don't know," Vivian said, and Marcus recognized the lie immediately. Her mother was French. Her father was English. She was orphaned young. I met her in Virginia and took responsibility for her welfare. That's all you need to know. That's not all I need to know. If she has African blood, then what? Vivian interrupted. Then she's somehow less human. Less deserving of kindness. Marcus, I didn't expect your approval. I don't require it. I'm simply informing you that I'm back in Mississippi and Catherine is under my protection. We'll live quietly. We won't create scandal, but I won't send her away and I won't treat her as property. Marcus stood. Then you are no longer my sister. I will not acknowledge you. I will not receive you. As far as the Ashford family is concerned, you died with father in 1834. This woman, whoever she is your responsibility. But if there is any scandal, any suggestion that she is enslaved and you're concealing it, any accusation of impropriety, I will not intervene. You will face the consequences alone. Vivian's expression didn't change. I understand. Goodbye, Marcus. He left without looking back. For 21 years, Vivian honored that arrangement. Marcus heard nothing from his sister except occasional mentions in Natchez society columns. Miss Ashford Whitmore and Miss Sterling attended the opera. Miss Ashford Whitmore and Miss Sterling have donated books to the ladies' library. They lived quietly, caused no scandal, and gradually became a familiar, if slightly odd, fixture of Natchez society. 2 women living together, no men, no servants except a housekeeper who came daily. People speculated, of course, but speculation wasn't evidence. Marcus married, had 2 sons, became one of the wealthiest men in Mississippi, and buried his wife after a fever took her in 1851. He never mentioned having a sister to anyone outside the immediate family. Then, in June 1863, everything changed. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from an address in Mobile. The handwriting was Vivian's but shaky. The letters uneven and occasionally smudged. The content was devastating. Marcus, I am dying. Cancer, diagnosed 8 months ago, now beyond any treatment. The doctors give me perhaps 6 weeks. I have one request, one final obligation I cannot fulfill alone. Catherine is 37 years old. She has lived with me for 21 years. She is educated, refined, capable of managing a household, skilled in music and needlework. She has never known slavery, never experienced cruelty, and I fear she would not survive it. When I die, she will be alone. She has no family, no money of her own, no legal protection. Everything I own reverts to Reginald, and he will not help her. He never forgave me for leaving. I am begging you, Marcus, to take her in. Not as family, I understand that's impossible. But as something. A housekeeper, perhaps. You've always needed someone refined enough to manage the main house. Someone who could supervise the other servants and handle correspondence. She would be useful to you. And Marcus, she is the only good thing I've done in my life. Everything else, the marriage, the rebellion, the years in exile, it was all selfish, all about my own pride. But caring for Catherine, protecting her, giving her a life where she could be safe and educated and treated with dignity, that was right. That mattered. Please, I am begging you. Don't let her be sold to someone who will destroy her. She deserves better than that. We all deserve better than what this world makes of us. Your sister, whether you acknowledge it or not, Vivian. Marcus read the letter 3 times, standing in his study with the afternoon sun brutal through the windows. The heat was oppressive even for Mississippi in June, and sweat dampened his collar as he held the pages. His first impulse was to refuse. The woman was his sister's companion, yes, but also clearly a person of color, however carefully that had been concealed. In Mississippi, especially in 1863, with the war creating chaos and suspicion everywhere, acknowledging her in any way was to risk questions, speculation, potential disaster. But Marcus was also a practical man. And as he stood there holding his dying sister's letter, an idea began to form. An idea that in hindsight should have horrified him. That it didn't say everything about what 29 months of war had done to him. The Confederacy was collapsing. Anyone with eyes could see it, even if they wouldn't say it aloud. Vicksburg had fallen on July 4th, Union forces controlled the Mississippi River. Confederate currency was nearly worthless. Within a year, maybe 2, the entire system that had made the Ashfords wealthy would be gone. But until then, valuable property could still be sold. Premium slaves were commanding extraordinary prices from wealthy families trying to preserve their assets before the final collapse. And if Catherine Sterling was as beautiful and refined as Vivian claimed, if she could pass for white in the right circumstances, she would be extraordinarily valuable, not for fieldwork, but as a status symbol, a piece of living art that would demonstrate a family's wealth and taste, even as their world crumbled around them. He sat down and wrote a response. He would take Catherine when Vivian died. She should send notice when the end was near and Marcus would come personally to collect her. He would make appropriate arrangements for her situation. He signed the letter, sealed it, and sent it express to Mobile. Then he sat alone in his study for a long time, thinking about opportunity and necessity, and the strange ways that war made certain decisions easier by making everything else impossible. Catherine Sterling arrived at Bellamont Plantation on July 19, 1863, on a Saturday afternoon that was brutally hot, even by Mississippi standards. Marcus had traveled to Mobile himself to collect her, bringing his most trusted overseer, a man named Dalton, and 2 house servants. Vivian had died 3 days earlier. The funeral had been small, attended mostly by women from the literary society and a few loyal friends who had ignored the whispers. Catherine had stood at the graveside in black mourning dress, her face veiled, her composure absolute. She hadn't cried, at least not where anyone could see. When Marcus arrived at the modest house in Mobile where Vivian had spent her final weeks, Catherine was waiting in the parlor. She stood when he entered, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. "Colonel Ashford," she said quietly. Her voice was cultured, soft, with that same indefinable accent that had always made people uncertain about her origins. "Thank you for coming. Miss Vivian spoke of you often in her final days. She hoped you would honor her request." Marcus studied her carefully, seeing what Vivian had protected for 21 years. Catherine Sterling was without question one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. At 37, she should have shown signs of aging, but her face remained remarkably youthful. Her skin was flawless, that pale translucent quality that suggested she had spent her entire life indoors, protected from sun and hardship. Her auburn hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken an hour to create, suggesting both skill and access to help. She wore a morning dress of fine black silk, simple but expensive, fitted to emphasize a slender figure that spoke of regular meals and no physical labor. But what struck Marcus most was her bearing. She stood like a lady, moved like a lady, spoke like a lady. Everything about her presentation suggested refinement, education, privilege. If he had encountered her at a social gathering in Jackson or Natchez, he would have assumed she was the daughter of a prosperous merchant or perhaps a widow of good family, except for one detail that a trained eye could detect, the almost imperceptible texture of her hair at the temples where the styling couldn't quite conceal it, and a certain quality to her bone structure that suggested mixed ancestry, however distant. In New Orleans or Charleston, she might have been classified as 1/8 African. In Mississippi in 1863, any African ancestry at all made her colored and therefore subject to enslavement if she couldn't prove her free status. And Catherine Sterling, Marcus knew from Vivian's letters, had no documentation, no birth certificate, no baptismal records, no papers of any kind. She existed only in Vivian's protection. And now Vivian was dead. "Miss Sterling," Marcus said finally, his tone formal. "I'm here to fulfill my sister's final request. However, we must discuss the practical realities of your situation." Catherine's expression didn't change, but her hands tightened slightly. "I understand. Do you?" Marcus stepped closer, studying her face. "My sister protected you from certain truths, I suspect, but those truths will determine your future, so we must address them directly. You are a woman of color, are you not?" A long silence, then very quietly, "My grandmother was colored." "Yes. My mother was born enslaved in Virginia, but she was freed before my birth. I was born free. Do you have documentation proving that?" "No." The word was barely audible. "The papers were lost when my mother died. I was 6 years old. Miss Vivian took me in shortly after, when she was still married to Mr. Whitmore. She saved me from being sold to settle my mother's debts." "So, you have no legal proof of free status?" "No." Marcus nodded slowly. This was exactly what he had suspected, what Vivian's carefully worded letters had implied without stating directly. Catherine Sterling was legally vulnerable, a woman of color without documentation in a slave state. In normal times, Vivian's protection and her own appearance might have been enough. But these weren't normal times. "Then I'm afraid I must be frank with you, Miss Sterling. Without papers, without my sister's protection, you are in an extremely precarious position. Any white person could claim you as property. You could be arrested as a runaway, detained, sold to cover debts, real or imagined. Mississippi law is quite clear on this matter." Catherine's composure finally cracked. "Colonel Ashford, please. Miss Vivian promised that you would help me. She said you were a man of honor despite your disagreements. She believed that you would not allow me to be." She stopped, unable to say the word. "Enslaved," Marcus applied. "But that's precisely what I'm offering you protection from. If you come with me to Bellamont, if you accept my guardianship, then no one else can touch you. You will be under my protection, recorded in my household, safe from those who might otherwise claim you." The trap was perfectly baited. Catherine understood what he was offering, but she also understood what accepting would mean. "And in exchange," she asked carefully, You will serve as housekeeper. You will manage the domestic servants, handle household accounts, supervise meals, and entertaining when necessary. You will have comfortable quarters, adequate food, appropriate clothing. You will be treated with respect befitting your education and refinement. Everything he said was technically true. It was also completely misleading. But Catherine, desperate and alone in a slave state with no protection and no papers, had no choice but to accept the vague promise and hope for the best. "I understand," she said finally. "When do we leave?" "Immediately. Pack only what you can carry in one trunk. We have a long journey ahead." Catherine's belongings fit into a single leather trunk that had seen better days. A few changes of clothing, all morning black. A small collection of books, poetry mostly, and a worn Bible. A miniature portrait of a woman who might have been her mother, though the daguerreotype was too faded to be certain. And most importantly, a packet of letters from Vivian tied with black ribbon. When Marcus examined the trunk's contents, he noted the absence of any official documents, any papers that might establish her identity or status. He also noted the quality of her possessions. Everything was well made but old, carefully maintained, but showing signs of repeated mending, the picture of genteel poverty, of someone who had once had access to fine things but had been making them last for years. They left Mobile that evening, traveling by coach to the river and then by hired steamboat north toward Vicksburg. The journey took 3 days. Catherine spent most of it in the small cabin Marcus had arranged for her, appearing only for meals and then only briefly. She spoke little, ate less, and watched the Mississippi landscape roll past with an expression that was impossible to read. Marcus spent those 3 days finalizing his plans. Catherine Sterling was extraordinarily valuable, far more valuable than even he had initially calculated. Her beauty, her refinement, her education, all of it made her a premium commodity in a market where such qualities commanded extraordinary prices. But her value was also her vulnerability. She was too distinctive, too memorable. At Bellamont, she would draw attention, create questions, invite speculation. Better to convert her value into currency quickly before the war's end made Confederate money worthless and before anyone could probe too deeply into her background. The auction in Jackson was scheduled for August 17th. That gave him almost a month to prepare her, to present her in the most advantageous light, to create the narrative that would maximize her sale price. They arrived at Bellamont on July 22nd in the evening. The plantation was still impressive despite the war's deprivations. The main house maintained, the grounds kept, the cotton fields showing healthy growth. It was a testament to Marcus's management skills and to the labor of the 183 people he still controlled despite the chaos everywhere else. Catherine stepped out of the carriage and looked at the great house with its white columns and magnolia-lined drive, and for just a moment her carefully maintained composure slipped. Her face showed naked fear. "It's magnificent," she said quietly. And Marcus understood that she was trying to convince herself this might actually be a household where she could work as a housekeeper, where Vivian's hope for her safety might somehow be realized. He said nothing. Better to let her hope last a few more hours. Marcus didn't take Catherine to the main house. Instead, he led her to a small cabin behind the kitchen building, one of several structures that housed the most valued house servants, the cook, the head housemaid, his personal valet. The cabin was better than the field quarters, but unmistakably not part of the main house itself. It was simple, one room with a bed, a small table, a chair, a washstand, and a narrow wardrobe. A single window looked out toward the cotton fields. In the July heat, the room was stifling despite the open window. "This will be your quarters," Marcus said. "Someone will bring you food and water. We'll discuss your duties in the morning. Do not leave this cabin tonight. Do not speak to anyone. Do you understand?" Catherine looked around the cabin, then back at Marcus, and he saw the moment when understanding began to dawn. This wasn't housekeeper quarters. This was slave quarters. "Colonel Ashford," she said carefully. "Miss Vivian understood that I would serve as housekeeper. Surely the housekeeper would reside in the main house, where I could properly supervise." "We'll discuss arrangements tomorrow," Marcus interrupted. "For tonight, you need rest. The journey was long and you're in mourning." Stay here. I'll send someone with supper. He left before she could protest further, locking the door from the outside. It was a small lock, easily broken if she was desperate enough, but he suspected she wouldn't try. Where would she run? Belmont was surrounded by cotton fields and swampland, 31 miles from Vicksburg, through territory that was increasingly dangerous with Confederate deserters and Union patrols. A woman alone, without papers, without money, without connections, she'd be captured within hours. That night, it was Delilah who brought food to the cabin. Delilah was the head housemaid, a woman of about 45 who had served the Ashford family since childhood. She was light-skinned herself, intelligent, and completely loyal to Marcus because loyalty was her only path to the small privileges that made her life bearable. She knocked softly, and when Catherine opened the door, Delilah studied her with the assessing gaze of someone who had learned to read situations quickly. "Brought you supper," Delilah said, handing over a tray. Rice, beans, a piece of chicken, cornbread. Simple plantation fare, not the refined cuisine Catherine would have eaten in Natchez. "Thank you," Catherine said. Her voice was hoarse, as if she'd been crying, though her eyes were dry. "I'm Catherine Sterling. Colonel Ashford's sister asked him to take me in as housekeeper after her death." Delilah's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. "That's so." "Yes. I'll be managing the household servants, handling accounts, that sort of thing. Perhaps tomorrow you could show me around the main house, help me understand the current arrangements." There was desperation in Catherine's voice, a need to establish her role, to claim the position Vivian had promised. Delilah set the tray down on the small table. "Miss Catherine," she said quietly, "I don't think that's what the Colonel has in mind." "What do you mean?" "I mean you in a locked cabin in the quarters, not in the main house. I mean the way he looked at you when you arrived. I mean the fact that he already got a housekeeper, that's me, has been for 12 years. Catherine went very still. "Then what am I?" Delilah looked at her for a long moment, her expression a mixture of pity and something harder. "I think you whatever the Colonel decides you are. And I think you better prepare yourself for that." She left before Catherine could respond, and Catherine heard the lock turn again from the outside. Catherine didn't sleep that night. She sat at the small table and tried to think through her options. She could refuse whatever Marcus proposed, could demand to leave, could threaten to expose his deception. But expose it to whom? She had no allies, no legal standing, no documentation. In Mississippi in 1863, a woman of color without papers wasn't a person filing a complaint. She was property waiting to be claimed. She could try to escape, could attempt to reach Union lines, could hope for protection from federal forces. But the Union Army was unpredictable in its treatment of escaped slaves and refugees. Some commanders helped, some didn't, and the journey to Union lines would take her through dangerous territory where any number of threats awaited a woman traveling alone. Or she could cooperate. Could hope that Marcus's promises had some truth to them. Could believe that her situation might somehow stabilize into actual employment rather than enslavement. That last option felt like self-delusion, but it was also the only path that didn't involve immediate disaster. When morning came, Catherine had made her decision. She would cooperate, at least until she understood exactly what Marcus intended. She would look for opportunities to establish her status, to create documentation, to build connections. And if none of that worked, she would find a way to escape. But she would not go quietly into slavery. Not after 37 years of freedom, not after everything Vivian had sacrificed to protect her. Marcus summoned Catherine to his study at 8 o'clock the next morning. The study was impressive, floor-to-ceiling bookcases filled with agricultural journals and account books, a massive desk made from walnut, windows overlooking the cotton fields that stretched to the horizon. On the walls hung portraits of Ashford ancestors going back 3 generations, all of them staring down with expressions of stern judgment. Catherine stood in front of the desk while Marcus sat behind it, the physical arrangement making the power dynamic unmistakable. "Miss Sterling," he began, his tone businesslike, "we need to discuss your situation with complete honesty. My sister had romantic notions about protecting you, about giving you a life of dignity and refinement. I respected her wishes while she lived, but now she's gone and we must deal with reality. Catherine said nothing, just waited. The reality is that you are a woman of color without documentation in a slave state during wartime. Your appearance allows you to pass for white in certain circumstances, but your ancestry makes you legally vulnerable to enslavement. Without my protection, you would be claimed within days, probably by someone far less scrupulous than myself. You promised your sister you would protect me, Catherine said quietly. And I am. But protection requires certain arrangements. You must understand that I cannot simply install you as a free woman in my household. The questions that would raise, the speculation about your relationship to my sister and to me, the potential scandal, it would be impossible. I have sons whose marriages and business relationships depend on my reputation. I cannot jeopardize all of that. Catherine felt something cold settle in her stomach. What are you proposing? Marcus opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a ledger. I'm proposing that we establish your status clearly and legally. You will be recorded in my plantation records as property acquired through my sister's estate. Your name will be listed simply as Catherine, no surname. Your age is 21 rather than 37. You look young enough to claim that, and it will increase your value. Your skills will be documented, literate, refined, trained in household management, music, needlework. Your classification will be domestic servant, suitable for the finest households. The words landed like blows. You're enslaving me. I'm establishing your legal status in a way that protects you from worse alternatives, Marcus corrected. And in exchange for this protection, you will serve the purpose for which you're most valuable, which is, he paused, then said it flatly, without emotion, I'm going to sell you. He let that hang in the air. There's an auction in Jackson on August 17th. Premium slaves are commanding extraordinary prices as wealthy families try to preserve their assets before the final collapse. Someone with your appearance and refinement will sell for a fortune, possibly setting a record. That money will allow me to secure my son's futures, to protect what we've built here. Catherine felt the room tilt. You promised Vivian, I promised to protect you from being claimed by strangers, and I have. The family that purchases you will be vetted. I'll ensure you go to a household where your refinement is valued, where you'll work indoors, where you'll be treated according to your education and bearing. That's the best outcome available under the circumstances. The best outcome would be honoring your sister's dying wish and treating me as a free woman. That outcome doesn't exist, Marcus said, his voice hardening. Not in Mississippi in 1863. Not for someone with your ancestry and no documentation. You can accept my protection and be sold to a good family, or you can refuse and take your chances with whoever claims you first. Those are your only options. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. This man, who had turned his sister's dying wish into a business opportunity, who was calmly explaining why enslaving her was actually a kindness. What if I refuse? She asked. What if I run? Then I'll have you hunted down and brought back. And when you're sold, I'll make sure the buyer knows you're a flight risk. That will affect your treatment substantially, I assure you. The threat was clear and effective. Catherine understood she was trapped, by geography, by law, by the war, by her lack of documentation and connections. Marcus held all the power, and he knew it. When do I begin? She asked finally, the words tasting like poison. Today. I need to prepare you for the auction. You'll need appropriate clothing, proper styling, coaching on how to present yourself. We have 3 weeks. That's enough time to create the perfect presentation. He began writing in the ledger, speaking aloud as he did. Acquired July 22, 1863, through the estate of Vivian Ashford Whitmore. One female, age 21, named Catherine, light-complexioned, highly educated, trained in all domestic arts, suitable for only the finest households. Estimated value, $4,000. He looked up at Catherine. Now you exist in my records. Your presence here is explained. Your future is secured as much as possible. This is, I believe, the best arrangement either of us could hope for under the circumstances. Catherine felt something inside her break. Not completely, but crack like glass under pressure. May I ask one question? Of course. Did you ever intend to honor your sister's request, or was this always your plan? Marcus was quiet for a moment, and something that might have been regret flickered across his face. I intended to do what was necessary to survive this war and protect my family. Everything else is sentiment, Miss Sterling, and sentiment doesn't survive what's coming. For 3 weeks, Catherine lived in a state of suspended disbelief. She cooperated because resistance seemed pointless. Because she kept hoping some opportunity for escape would present itself. Because the alternative to hope was despair that felt too dangerous to indulge. Marcus hired a woman from Vicksburg, a French dressmaker named Madame Rousseau, to create appropriate clothing. Catherine was measured, fitted, dressed in styles designed to emphasize her beauty while suggesting refinement rather than sexuality, pale colors that complemented her skin, simple but elegant designs, nothing too elaborate or attention-seeking. The goal was to present her as a valuable asset, a living work of art that would elevate any household fortunate enough to acquire her. Delilah was assigned to help with Catherine's hair and general presentation. She taught Catherine how to arrange her auburn locks in styles that concealed the texture that might reveal her ancestry, how to move in ways that emphasized grace, how to keep her expression neutral and pleasant regardless of what she felt. "You got to think of it like acting," Delilah said one afternoon while practicing different hairstyles. "You playing a part, the beautiful, refined, perfectly trained servant who's grateful for the opportunity to serve in a fine house. You play that part well enough at the auction, you might get bought by someone who will treat you decent. And if I don't play the part well..." Delilah's hands paused in Catherine's hair. "Then you get bought by someone who wants to break you, someone who will see your education and refinement as a challenge. Better to be underestimated, Miss Catherine. Better to seem grateful and compliant than proud and difficult." Catherine absorbed this advice, understanding that Delilah was trying to help in the only way she could, by teaching her how to survive in a system that neither of them could escape. The other enslaved people at Bellamont didn't know what to make of Catherine. She looked white, spoke like a lady, lived in separate quarters, and received treatment that seemed preferential, but was clearly preparation for something. Some were kind to her. A man named Joshua, who worked in the stables, brought her wildflowers once, saying they reminded him of her hair. An elderly woman named Aunt Ruth, who helped in the kitchen, smuggled her extra food when no one was looking. Others avoided her, resentful of her appearance and uncertain about her status. She existed in a category that didn't make sense, and that made people uncomfortable. Catherine navigated this carefully, accepting kindness when offered, but never presuming on it, understanding that she was an outsider, even among the enslaved, because she had lived 37 years as a free woman, and it showed in everything she did. She wrote letters, long, detailed letters to no one in particular, documenting everything that had happened since Vivian's death. She wrote about Marcus's deception, the confiscation of her status, the planned auction. She wrote, knowing the letters would probably never be sent, never be read, but needing to create some record that she existed as more than property. She hid the letters in the lining of her trunk, sewn into a hidden pocket she created late at night by candlelight. They were her only rebellion, her only assertion of selfhood in a situation designed to erase her. On August 10, 1 week before the auction, Marcus informed Catherine that they would travel to Jackson in 3 days. She would be housed at the Capitol Street auction house itself in one of the secure rooms where premium property was kept before sale. "The auction house is expecting you," he said. "I've provided them with your documentation. They understand you're an exceptional offering and will treat you accordingly. You'll be well cared for before the sale." "How generous," Catherine said, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus looked at her sharply. "I would advise you not to develop a sharp tongue, Miss Sterling. It will not serve you well with potential buyers. Refinement is valuable. Insolence is not." "I understand perfectly, Colonel." The journey to Jackson took 2 days. Catherine traveled in a closed carriage with Delilah as a companion, while Marcus and Dalton, the overseer, rode separately. It was August in Mississippi, brutally hot, and the roads were rough from recent rains and neglect during the war years. Catherine watched the landscape roll past, cotton fields, pine forests, small settlements that looked half-abandoned, occasional glimpses of Union patrols in the distance. The Confederacy was dying. Everyone could see it, but it was dying slowly, violently, and institutions like slavery continued functioning even as the system that supported them crumbled. They arrived in Jackson on August 15th in the late afternoon. The city was crowded despite the war. Merchants, soldiers, refugees, opportunists, all of them trying to survive or profit from the chaos. The Capitol Street auction house was a substantial brick building in the center of the commercial district, impressive and permanent-looking despite everything collapsing around it. Catherine was taken to a room on the second floor. Not exactly a cell, but not a guest room either. It had a bed, a washstand, a small table, and barred windows that looked out onto the street. The room was clean and relatively comfortable, designed to keep valuable property in good condition before sale. "You'll stay here until the auction," Marcus said. "Someone will bring meals. The auction house staff will help you prepare tomorrow, bathing, dressing, final styling. The auction begins at 10 o'clock on the 17th. You'll be presented at approximately 11 o'clock, after some preliminary sales, but early enough that the crowd is still fresh and engaged." Catherine sat on the edge of the bed and looked at him. "Colonel Ashford, I'm going to ask you one last time to reconsider. Honor your sister's memory. Let me go. I've honored her memory by ensuring you'll be sold to the best possible household. That's more than most people in your situation receive. I am not in my situation. You put me here." "No, Miss Sterling. History put you here. I'm simply working within the constraints history has provided. Everything else is sentiment." He moved toward the door. "I'll see you at the auction. I recommend you use these next 2 days to prepare yourself mentally. What happens at that auction will determine the rest of your life. Make sure you understand how to present yourself properly." He left, and Catherine heard the lock turn. For 2 days, Catherine existed in a strange limbo. The auction house staff, all of them enslaved people themselves working in the grotesque industry of human sales, were kind to her in small ways. They brought good food, helped her bathe, arranged her hair, treated her with a deference that suggested they recognized she was different from most people who came through these rooms. A young woman named Pearl, who worked as a domestic at the auction house, spent time talking with Catherine on the evening of the 16th. "I seen a lot of people come through here," Pearl said while brushing Catherine's hair. "But you different. You don't belong here." "None of us belong here," Catherine said quietly. "That's true enough. But most folks been enslaved their whole lives. They know how to survive it. You." Pearl paused. "You got that look like you still free in your head. That's dangerous, Miss Catherine. That kind of thinking make you do something desperate at the wrong time. What would you do in my situation?" Pearl was quiet for a long moment. "I'd remember that surviving is winning. Whatever you got to do to get through tomorrow, to get bought by someone decent, to live long enough that this war ends and everything changes, that's winning. Pride don't keep you alive. Smart does." Catherine absorbed this wisdom, understanding that Pearl was trying to help her survive. But she also understood something Pearl might not, that there were things worse than death, and spending the rest of her life enslaved after 37 years of freedom might be one of them. That night, Catherine made a decision. She wouldn't go silently to the auction block. She wouldn't cooperate with her own erasure. She would speak, even if it destroyed her, because being destroyed as herself was better than surviving as someone else's property. She spent the night writing one more letter, her final one, addressed to the military governor of Mississippi. She documented everything: Vivian's death, Marcus's promises, the confiscation of her status, the planned auction. She wrote in clear, educated language that demonstrated exactly what was being sold tomorrow: not an uneducated field worker, but a woman who had lived free for nearly 4 decades, who could write and reason and testify to her own humanity. She folded the letter carefully and hid it in the bodice of the dress she would wear tomorrow. It was a risk. If searched, she would be punished. But she had to try something. She had to create some record, some testimony that she existed as more than merchandise. The morning of August 17, 1863, dawned clear and oppressively hot. By 9 o'clock, the Capitol Street auction house was already crowded with buyers, speculators, and curious onlookers. The war had made these auctions even more dramatic, wealthy families desperately trying to preserve some assets, opportunists looking for bargains, soldiers on leave spending their pay, and always the undercurrent of knowing this might be one of the last major auctions before the whole system collapsed. The auction house's main room was impressive: high ceilings, large windows, a raised platform at one end where property would be displayed. The room was already hot from the press of bodies, and servants moved through the crowd offering water and sweet tea to keep the buyers comfortable. Marcus arrived early, dressed in his finest despite the heat, determined to present himself as a gentleman of means selling a premium asset. He had spread word through his social connections that something exceptional would be offered today, and the crowd reflected that anticipation. At 10 o'clock, the auctioneer, a professional named William Thornton who had conducted thousands of sales, took his position and began the proceedings. The first hour consisted of routine sales: field workers, domestic servants, skilled craftsmen. Prices were high, reflecting both the late war desperation and the quality of the offerings. At 11 o'clock, Thornton paused and surveyed the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the humid air, "we now come to an offering of truly exceptional quality. I've been conducting auctions for 23 years, and I can say without exaggeration that what you're about to see represents the finest example of refined domestic service available in the Confederacy." The crowd's attention sharpened. This was what many of them had come for. The property of Colonel Marcus Ashford of Bellamont Plantation, recently acquired from his late sister's estate. "I present to you Catherine." Two attendants escorted Catherine onto the platform. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Catherine was dressed in a gown of pale blue silk that Madame Rousseau had created specifically for this moment. Simple but elegant, fitted to emphasize her slender figure, the color perfect against her pale skin and auburn hair. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that Pearl had spent 2 hours creating, concealing any texture that might reveal her ancestry while emphasizing her beauty. She wore no jewelry, nothing to distract from the spectacle of herself. She was, without question, one of the most beautiful women most people in that room had ever seen. And she looked white, completely, undeniably white, with nothing in her appearance to suggest otherwise. The crowd went utterly silent, then erupted in murmurs of amazement. Thornton let the reaction build for a moment before continuing. Age 21 years. Literate in English and functional in French. Trained in all domestic arts, including household management, needlework, and music. She plays piano to an advanced level and has been educated in deportment and etiquette. Suitable only for the most refined households. Health certified excellent. Character certified obedient and gentle. He was reading from notes Marcus had provided, creating the narrative that would maximize value. Minimum bid set at $3,000. The bidding started immediately. A merchant in the front row, $3,200. Before Thornton could acknowledge it, someone else, $3,500. Then $4,000. The crowd was energized, feeding off its own momentum. This wasn't just a purchase, it was a competition, a display of wealth and power and taste. To own Catherine would be to own something extraordinary, something that would demonstrate status even as the Confederate world collapsed. Throughout all of this, Catherine stood perfectly still on the platform, her face carefully composed, showing nothing of what she felt. She had learned from Delilah and Pearl how to survive this moment, by disappearing inside herself, by becoming a mask, by removing her consciousness from her body until this violation was over. But she was also waiting for the right moment to speak. The bidding climbed: $4,500, $5,000, $5,500. At $6,000, most of the bidders dropped out. At $7,000, only two remained, a plantation owner named Cornelius Whitfield and a wealthy widow named Mrs. Arabella Sinclair, who ran a fashionable boarding house in Jackson and was known for maintaining a staff of exceptionally refined servants. $7,500, Mrs. Sinclair said firmly. $8,000, Whitfield countered immediately. The crowd was transfixed. This was an unprecedented amount, approaching the record for any domestic servant ever sold in Mississippi. At $8,500, Mrs. Sinclair hesitated. The sum represented a year's income for a prosperous business, an irrational amount to pay for a single servant, no matter how refined. Thornton, sensing her uncertainty, looked toward Whitfield. "Sir, do you counter?" Whitfield nodded. $9,000. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $9,000 for a single slave was extraordinary, a price that defied all economic logic but made perfect sense in terms of status and spectacle. Thornton turned to Mrs. Sinclair. "Madam." She looked at Catherine one more time, her expression unreadable. Then she said clearly, $9,500. The crowd erupted. This was history being made, a record that would stand for however long the Confederacy lasted. Whitfield looked ready to counter, but before Thornton could ask, Catherine spoke. 3 words, barely loud enough to carry past the first few rows, but spoken in that cultured voice that everyone recognized as belonging to an educated woman: "I am free." The effect was instantaneous and total. Several people gasped audibly. Others looked confused. Had they heard correctly? Marcus's face went white, then flushed an angry red. Dalton moved toward the platform, but Thornton held up his hand, stopping him. In 23 years of conducting auctions, he had never had property claim freedom from the block. "Silence," Thornton said sharply. "You are not permitted to speak." Catherine turned her gray-green eyes directly on the auctioneer. When she spoke again, her voice was clearer, stronger, carrying across the stunned room with perfect clarity. "My name is Catherine Sterling. I am the ward of Vivian Ashford Whitmore, who died in Mobile on July 16th of this year. I lived as a free woman in Natchez, Mississippi, for 21 years under Miss Whitmore's protection. I was born free. I have never been enslaved. Upon Miss Whitmore's death, Colonel Marcus Ashford promised her he would provide me refuge and employment as a housekeeper. Instead, he confiscated my status and fraudulently entered me into his records as property. Under Mississippi law, I cannot be legally enslaved. I am free. This sale is a fraud, and everyone participating in it is complicit in an illegal act." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. For perhaps 5 seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. The room might have been frozen in time. Then chaos erupted. Marcus lunged toward the platform, shouting that Catherine was delusional, that she was the daughter of his sister's slave and had been raised with foolish notions about her status. Thornton stepped back from the podium, clearly unsure of his legal ground. Several men in the crowd began arguing loudly, some insisting the sale should be stopped immediately until Catherine's claims could be investigated, others maintaining that a slave's testimony was worthless and the auction should continue. Mrs. Sinclair had gone very pale and was speaking urgently to a man beside her, apparently her lawyer. Whitfield was demanding to see documentation, any documentation that would clarify the situation. In the middle of this chaos, something remarkable happened. A man in a Union officer's uniform pushed through the crowd to the platform. He identified himself as Captain James Morrison, Provost Marshal for the Military District of Jackson. His voice, trained to command troops in battle, cut through the noise. "This auction is suspended immediately by order of the military governor. This woman's status requires investigation before any sale can proceed." The effect was explosive. Thornton looked at the officer, then at Marcus, then at Catherine, clearly calculating his own liability. If Catherine was truly free and this sale proceeded, everyone involved could face federal prosecution. But if Catherine was not free and the sale was stopped, Marcus and the bidders would have grounds for complaint against the auction house. Marcus, recovering from his initial shock, produced documents from his jacket, the plantation ledger entry he had created showing Catherine recorded as property acquired July 22nd. "She is confused," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "My sister kept a slave named Catherine, the daughter of one of her household servants. She educated this woman as a charitable act. And unfortunately, it filled her head with impossible ideas. She genuinely believes she's free, but she's mistaken. I have documentation proving she's property legally acquired from my sister's estate." Captain Morrison examined the ledger entry, then looked at Catherine. "Miss, do you have any documentation supporting your claim?" Catherine felt time slow down. This was the moment. Everything depended on what happened next. "No, sir," she said clearly. "Colonel Ashford confiscated my personal papers when I arrived at his plantation. But I can provide testimony about my life in Natchez, names of people who knew me as Miss Whitmore's companion, details about my education that no enslaved person would possess. I can write in both English and French. I can discuss literature, music, history. I can demonstrate that I am exactly who I claim to be, a free woman fraudulently enslaved by a man who saw opportunity in his dying sister's final request." Morrison turned to Marcus. "Colonel, if you have documentation proving this woman's enslaved status, present it now. If such documentation exists, we'll proceed accordingly. If it doesn't, this woman will be removed from this auction and held in federal custody pending full investigation." Marcus's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: anger, calculation, fear. He had the ledger entry, but that proved only that he had recorded Catherine as property. It didn't prove she had actually been enslaved before he recorded her. And now there was a Union officer involved, federal authority that could expose everything. He made a decision. "The documentation is at Bellamont Plantation," he said. "Original bills of sale, records of birth, everything necessary to prove her status. If Captain Morrison requires it, I can produce it within 3 days." It was a gamble. He was buying time to either produce forged documents or to find some other solution to this disaster. Morrison nodded slowly. "Then this auction is suspended pending presentation of that documentation. Miss Catherine Sterling," he used her full name deliberately, "will be held in federal custody at the military headquarters until this matter is resolved. All bids are voided. This sale will not proceed today." 2 Union soldiers who had apparently accompanied Morrison stepped forward. They didn't shackle Catherine, which was telling. They weren't certain she was enslaved, which meant they had to treat her as potentially free. As Catherine was escorted off the platform, she passed Marcus. Their eyes met, and she saw in his expression a complicated mixture of rage and something that might have been grudging respect. She had destroyed his plan, exposed his fraud, and cost him $9,500 in a single moment of courage. She said nothing. There was nothing to say. Everything that needed to be spoken had been said in front of hundreds of witnesses in that sweltering auction house. Catherine was taken to a room in the military headquarters building, a former hotel that Union forces had commandeered when they occupied Jackson. The room was simple but adequate: a bed, a chair, a small table, a washstand, and a window that looked out onto the street. She was locked in but not chained. She was guarded but not treated as a prisoner. For 5 days she waited while military lawyers and investigators examined her case. During that time, several things happened. Vivian Ashford Whitmore's death was confirmed, along with the basic facts of Catherine's residence in Natchez. Several people in Natchez, when contacted by Union investigators, remembered Miss Whitmore and her companion and confirmed they had lived as free women for over 2 decades. Marcus produced documents claiming to show Catherine's enslaved status, but the documents were suspicious. They included a bill of sale dated 1841 for a slave named Catherine, supposedly purchased by Vivian in Virginia. But the paper was too new, the ink too fresh, and the supposed seller's signature didn't match examples of that person's handwriting in Virginia court records. Most damningly, Marcus couldn't produce Vivian's original request letter. He claimed it had been destroyed, but investigators found that implausible. Why would he destroy the letter from his dying sister, but preserve other correspondence? The hidden letter Catherine had sewn into her dress was discovered during a search of her belongings and turned over to investigators. The letter, written in Catherine's elegant hand, provided a detailed account of everything that had happened since Vivian's death. More importantly, it demonstrated literacy and reasoning ability consistent with Catherine's claims about her education and free status. On August 22, Captain Morrison issued his finding. The determination was careful, legalistic, and devastating to Marcus. Based on available evidence, including testimony from Natchez residents, analysis of Colonel Ashford's documentation, and Miss Sterling's demonstrated education and capabilities, this office finds insufficient evidence to support Colonel Ashford's claim of prior enslavement. While definitive proof of Miss Sterling's free status is unavailable due to the destruction of relevant records, the preponderance of evidence suggests she lived as a free woman under Miss Whitmore's protection for at least 2 decades. Therefore, the attempted sale is declared void and fraudulent. Colonel Ashford's claim to Miss Sterling as property is rejected. Miss Sterling is remanded to the custody of the Provost Marshal's office pending final determination of her status by higher military authority. Furthermore, Colonel Ashford is hereby notified that fraudulent enslavement of free persons is a criminal offense under federal law and military regulations. Should Miss Sterling's free status be definitively established, prosecution may follow. It was a carefully worded ruling that protected everyone while resolving nothing definitively. Catherine wasn't declared legally free, but she couldn't be held as enslaved either. She existed in legal limbo, but limbo was infinitely better than the auction block. Marcus, reading the ruling in his hotel room in Jackson, understood he had lost. He couldn't prove Catherine had been enslaved before July 22 because she hadn't been. Any further pursuit would risk federal prosecution and would definitely attract scrutiny to his business practices that he couldn't afford. He left Jackson that day, returning to Bellamont. He never attempted to reclaim Catherine, never filed appeals, never mentioned her name again in any surviving correspondence. Catherine was released from military custody on August 25, 8 days after the auction. Captain Morrison provided her with a military pass identifying her as Catherine Sterling, free woman under federal protection, and enough money to reach Memphis, where Union control was more firmly established and she might find actual safety. "This pass won't make you legally free everywhere," Morrison told her honestly. "But it should protect you in Union-controlled territory. Get to Memphis, then maybe farther north if you can. Don't stay in Mississippi. It's not safe for you here." Catherine took the pass and the money with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you, Captain. You saved my life. You saved your own life, Miss Sterling. Most people in your situation would never have spoken up. They would have gone to that sale silently and disappeared. You refused to disappear." Catherine smiled, but there was no happiness in it. "I've been disappearing for 37 years, Captain. Passing for white, hiding my ancestry, living under someone else's protection. I'm tired of disappearing. If I'm going to be destroyed, at least let it be as myself." She left Jackson the next day, traveling by military transport to Memphis. What happened after that is where history blurs into mystery. Some records suggest a woman named Catherine Sterling worked as a schoolteacher in Ohio in 1865, teaching freed slaves to read and write. A pension application filed in Illinois in 1889 lists a Catherine Whitmore Sterling, born approximately 1826, occupation educator, but provides no other details. A photograph from the 1870s, found in a Chicago Historical Society collection, shows an elderly woman identified only as C.S., teacher, whose face bears a striking resemblance to descriptions of Catherine Sterling from the 1863 auction. But these are fragments, possibilities, not certainties. Catherine Sterling disappeared into the chaos of war and Reconstruction. And if she survived, if she built a new life somewhere under her own name or a new one, she left almost no trace. What is documented is this: Marcus Ashford never recovered from the scandal. His reputation was permanently damaged. Several business partners quietly severed connections. The story of the fraudulent auction spread through both Union and Confederate circles, the men who tried to sell his own sister's ward, who forged documents and nearly got away with it until the victim spoke up. That story had power, and it destroyed him socially, if not financially. In 1866, with the war over and the plantation system collapsing, Marcus sold Bellamont and moved to Texas, trying to start over. He died there in 1871, relatively young at 69, of what his doctor called nervous exhaustion and melancholia. His surviving letters from those final years mentioned nightmares about auctions and a woman with gray-green eyes who wouldn't stop speaking. The Capitol Street auction house closed in 1864 and was eventually demolished. No plaque marks its location. The building that replaced it has no memory of what occurred there. The records of the August 17, 1863 auction were sealed by order of the Mississippi legislature in 1864, supposedly to protect the privacy of prominent families involved in wartime transactions. Those records remain sealed today. Historians have petitioned for access multiple times. Every petition has been denied. The official reason varies, but always amounts to privacy concerns regarding descendants and ongoing legal sensitivities. But the sale was 160 years ago. Anyone directly involved is long dead. Privacy concerns don't usually extend across centuries, unless there's something else: proof of fraud, documented criminal activity, evidence of complicity by other prominent families, or perhaps simply a record so damning that the state prefers to keep it buried. Or maybe the records contain evidence of what happened to Catherine afterward, where she went, what name she used, how she survived. Maybe somewhere in those sealed documents is the answer to the question everyone wants to know: did she make it? Did she actually escape? Did she build a life somewhere as a free woman, finally, legally, undeniably? The evidence suggests she did. The military pass Morrison gave her was real. Union-controlled territories were safer for people like Catherine, especially after 1865, and the complete absence of any record of her being recaptured or re-enslaved, the silence where there should have been noise if Marcus had found her, all of it points toward escape, survival, reinvention. Maybe she went north to Ohio or Illinois, as some evidence suggests. Maybe she became the teacher in those fragmentary records, spending her later years helping others gain the education that had saved her. Maybe she married, had children, grew old, and died without ever telling anyone about the 2 months in 1863 when she had been neither enslaved nor free, when her entire existence had hung in balance while strangers debated her humanity. If that's true, then somewhere in the records of Chicago or Cleveland or some other city, there might be a death certificate for a woman with the name Sterling or Whitmore, born around 1826, occupation listed as teacher or educator, with no other details. And if someone found that certificate and traced it back, they might discover it belonged to Catherine Sterling, who was almost sold in Jackson and spoke her own name and then vanished into legend. But maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question isn't whether Catherine escaped or where she went or what happened to her. Maybe the question is why we need to know, why this story, out of thousands of similar stories from that era, compels us. I think it's because Catherine's story does something powerful. It shows someone refusing erasure. Most people in her situation simply vanished from history, swallowed by a system designed to erase them. But Catherine didn't vanish. She stood on that platform and said her own name. She claimed her identity in front of hundreds of witnesses. She forced the system to acknowledge her, even when it couldn't figure out how to categorize her. And then, yes, she disappeared, but on her own terms, after making sure everyone knew exactly who she was. That's not erasure. That's transformation. That's choosing to become invisible rather than being forced into invisibility. There's a profound difference. This story shows us something important about identity, freedom, and the terrible fragility of both. Catherine Sterling should never have been on that auction block. The fact that her humanity was considered a legal question requiring adjudication tells us everything we need to know about the system that put her there. But it also shows us something about resistance, about refusing to accept other people's definitions of who you are, about the power of simply saying your own name when everyone else wants to rename you. Catherine stood on that platform and said, "I am free," knowing it might destroy her. And whether or not those words changed her immediate circumstances, they changed the story. They transformed her from a passive victim into an active participant in her own fate. And maybe that's why we're still telling this story 160 years later. Because Catherine won. Not in court, not in any complete legal sense, but in the way that matters most. She refused to be forgotten. She made sure that anyone who tried to erase her would have to work hard to do it. And she left enough traces, the testimony, the letter, the military pass, the whispered stories, that we can still find her if we look. So what do you think? Do you believe Catherine Sterling really was free? Do you think she escaped and survived? Or do you think something else happened after she left Jackson with that military pass? And why would Mississippi keep those auction records sealed if there wasn't something explosive in them? Something that still matters even now. Leave your comment below. Tell me what you think happened to Catherine Sterling. And if you enjoyed this story, this mystery they tried to bury, then subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. Share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries, stories about people who fell through the cracks of history, stories that someone wanted erased, because every view, every share, every comment helps bring these forgotten voices back to life. And maybe, somewhere in some sealed record or dusty archive, the full truth about Catherine Sterling is still waiting to be found.